December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The United States is attacked. The American Pacific Fleet is destroyed. Over 1,000 Americans are killed. The nation is in shock. The nation is humiliated. The American people want revenge. The American military wants revenge. President Franklin D. Roosevelt wants revenge. But America cannot strike back immediately. The American military is crippled. The Pacific Fleet is destroyed. American bases are under attack. The American military needs to do something dramatic, something to restore American morale, something to show Japan that America can strike back. But America doesn't have the military capability to strike back effectively. Then someone proposes an audacious plan. What if bombers could take off from an aircraft carrier? Bombers are too large. Bombers need too much runway. Bombers cannot take off from aircraft carriers. Everyone knows this. It's a fact of aviation. It's impossible. But then a man named Jimmy Doolittle proposes something audacious. Doolittle says, we can do it. We can take off B-25 bombers from an aircraft carrier. We can fly to Tokyo. We can bomb Japan. We can return to China. Everyone thinks Doolittle is crazy, but Doolittle gets permission. The plan is approved. In April 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, 16 B-25 bombers are loaded onto the USS Hornet aircraft carrier. 16 bombers, 80 airmen. One impossible mission. The bombers take off from the carrier deck. They fly toward Japan, over 600 miles in radio silence. In darkness, the bombers reach Japan, Tokyo, the heart of enemy territory, and then the bombers do something Japan thought impossible. The bombers bomb Tokyo directly, from the air, over a year before the strategic bombing campaign that would devastate Japan. This is the Doolittle raid, one of the most audacious military operations in history. 16 bombers, 80 men. One impossible mission. But here's what most people don't know. The Doolittle raid was not what the official history says it was. The damage done was minimal. A few fires, some casualties, but nothing strategically important. Japan barely noticed the raid. So why did America plan and execute such a risky operation? Why send 16 bombers and 80 men on a mission where none were expected to return? Why risk the USS Hornet, one of the few remaining aircraft carriers? Why take such a risk for minimal military benefit? What was the real purpose of the Doolittle raid? Was it morale? Was it propaganda? Was it a secret military objective that was never publicly stated? This is the story of the Doolittle raid. But it's not the story you think you know. In April 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, to understand the Doolittle raid, you must understand the context of the Pacific War in early 1942. By April 1942, Japan had conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Wake Island, Guam, New Britain. Japan seemed invincible. Japan had won every battle. Japan had conquered vast territories. Japan had decimated American naval power at Pearl Harbor. The American people were terrified. Americans feared invasion. Americans feared that Japan might attack the American mainland. Americans feared that America might lose the war in the Pacific. American morale was very low. The American military had only one carrier left, the USS Hornet and USS Lexington, newly built. American production was ramping up, but would take years to replace the destroyed Pacific Fleet. In this context of American fear and Japanese dominance, President Roosevelt needed to do something dramatic. Roosevelt called his military planners to the White House. Roosevelt said, "I want the American people to know that America can strike back at Japan." Roosevelt said, "I want Japan to know that America is not defeated." Roosevelt said, "I want to bomb Tokyo." The military planners said, "That's impossible, Mr. President. Bombing Tokyo would require long-range aircraft to fly all the way to Tokyo, a way to get those aircraft to Tokyo, a way to get them back. The only way to reach Tokyo was to fly from an aircraft carrier. But bombers cannot take off from aircraft carriers. Bombers are too large. Bombers need too much runway." Or so everyone believed. Then Jimmy Doolittle, a legendary aviator and test pilot, was brought into the planning. Doolittle had a reputation for doing the impossible. Doolittle had set numerous aviation records. Doolittle had pushed the boundaries of what was possible in aviation. Doolittle studied the problem. Doolittle calculated the weights. Doolittle calculated the carrier deck length. Doolittle calculated the fuel requirements. And Doolittle said, "It's possible. If we strip the bombers down, if we reduce weight, if we practice the takeoff, if we use the full length of the carrier deck, then it's possible to take off a B-25 bomber from an aircraft carrier. But there's a catch. After takeoff, there's no way to land the bombers back on the carrier. The bombers are too heavy to land on a carrier. The bombers will have to fly all the way to China, or ditch in the Pacific Ocean. In other words, this is a one-way mission for the bombers. The crews will not return to the USS Hornet. The crews will fly to China, or crash, or be captured by the Japanese. This is the context for the Doolittle raid. America is desperate. America's morale is low. America needs a dramatic victory. America needs to show that it can strike at Japan. And Jimmy Doolittle offers a solution that is audacious, a solution that is dangerous, a solution that will require men to volunteer for a mission where they might not return. The volunteers come forward, men, pilots and crew members. They train. They practice taking off from a carrier deck. They strip down their bombers to reduce weight. They prepare for the impossible mission. By April 1942, they are ready. The USS Hornet, with 16 B-25 bombers on its deck, sets sail for the Pacific. The Hornet approaches Japan. The bombers take off. They fly toward Tokyo. This is the Doolittle raid, one of the most audacious military operations in history. The first B-25 bomber takes off from the USS Hornet. Against all odds, it becomes airborne. One after another, 16 B-25 bombers take off from the carrier deck. All of them successfully become airborne. This is remarkable. This has never been done before. Large bombers taking off from an aircraft carrier, and all 16 successfully take off. The bombers fly toward Japan, over 600 miles in radio silence. In daylight, the bombers reach Japan. They reach Tokyo, and here is the first anomaly. The Japanese defense is almost non-existent. There are Japanese fighters in the air, but they fail to stop the American bombers. The bombers drop their bombs on Tokyo. The damage is limited, a few fires, some casualties, but nothing that threatens Tokyo's ability to function. The raid did not destroy any military targets. The raid did not destroy any aircraft. The raid did not destroy any ships. The raid did not destroy any weapons or ammunition. So why was this raid considered such an important military operation? From a military perspective, the Doolittle raid was not very significant. From a military perspective, the raid accomplished very little. But here's the second anomaly. The psychological impact was enormous. Japan was shocked. Japan had believed Tokyo was invulnerable. Japan had believed Japan's homeland was safe from American attack. The Doolittle raid proved that Japan's homeland was vulnerable. The raid proved that American aircraft could reach Tokyo. The raid proved that Japan could not prevent American bombing. And here's the third anomaly. After the raid, some of the bombers had to land in China. Some bombers crashed in China. Some bombers ditched in the Pacific. Of the 80 airmen who took off, 71 survived initially, 64 reached China, 3 landed in Soviet territory and were interned. Approximately 10 were captured by the Japanese. Of the 10 captured by the Japanese, 3 were executed by the Japanese and survived the war, though some were mistreated. This is the anomaly. The American airmen were treated brutally by the Japanese. Some were executed, some were tortured, some were used for medical experiments. This raises a question. Why would the Japanese execute American pilots who were captured? The execution of the American pilots suggests the Japanese took the raid very seriously. The Japanese were angry about the raid. The Japanese wanted revenge. But why would Japan execute American pilots for a raid that caused minimal damage? This is the key anomaly. The military impact of the Doolittle raid was minimal, but the psychological impact was enormous, and the Japanese response was severe. This discrepancy suggests something important. There was something about the Doolittle raid that was more significant than just the military damage. This raises a question. Why would the Japanese execute American pilots who were captured? The execution of the American pilots suggests the Japanese took the raid very seriously. The Japanese were angry about the raid. The Japanese wanted revenge. But why would Japan execute American pilots for a raid that caused minimal damage? This is the key anomaly. The military impact of the Doolittle raid was minimal, but the psychological impact was enormous, and the Japanese response was severe. This discrepancy suggests something important. There was something about the Doolittle raid that was more significant than just the military damage. To understand the true purpose of the Doolittle raid, we must look at the evidence, the data, the military records, the strategic analysis. First, let's understand the strategic situation in April 1942. America had just suffered the Pearl Harbor attack. America had suffered the Battle of the Java Sea, February 1942, which was a Japanese victory. America had suffered the loss of the Philippines, April 1942. American morale was very low. The American people were questioning, can America win this war? The Joint Chiefs of Staff realized, America needs a morale boost. America needs to demonstrate that America can strike back at Japan. Here's what American intelligence knew about Tokyo in April 1942. Tokyo had very limited air defense. Most of Japan's fighters were deployed elsewhere, in Southeast Asia, in the Southwest Pacific. Tokyo was essentially undefended. American intelligence realized Tokyo is vulnerable to air attack. American intelligence realized a bombing raid on Tokyo would be possible. American intelligence realized a bombing raid on Tokyo would have enormous psychological impact. This intelligence assessment is the key to understanding the Doolittle raid. The primary objective of the Doolittle raid was morale, not military damage, morale. President Roosevelt wanted warn American people to see that America could strike back, too. Japanese people to fear that America could bomb Tokyo 3. American military to demonstrate capability despite setbacks. The military impact was secondary. The psychological impact was primary. Here's another element of the investigation. The USS Hornet was used to transport the bombers to Japan. The USS Hornet was one of the few remaining aircraft carriers. Using the USS Hornet for this operation risked the carrier. The USS Hornet could have been sunk by the Japanese. The USS Hornet was one of the few assets America had left. But the military was willing to take this risk. Why? Because the morale boost was more important than military caution. After the Doolittle raid, American propaganda emphasized 16 bombers flew 600-plus miles to Tokyo. All 16 bombers successfully reached Tokyo. Tokyo was bombed by American aircraft. America could strike at Japan's homeland. The American propaganda exaggerated the damage. The propaganda said the damage was more significant than it actually was. The propaganda said the raid had destroyed large areas of Tokyo, but the actual damage was limited. The Japanese were completely surprised by the raid. The Japanese had no warning. The Japanese had no defense prepared. Now we get to the most brutal element of the investigation. Why did the Japanese execute captured American pilots? The Japanese executed the pilots because 1. The Japanese were angry about the bombing of Tokyo 2. The Japanese wanted to punish the American bombing crews 3. The Japanese wanted to deter future bombing raids. But there's a deeper element. The Japanese execution of the pilots suggests that the Japanese understood the psychological importance of the raid. The Japanese took the raid very seriously. The Japanese were not just responding to military damage. The Japanese were responding to the psychological threat. From a military perspective, the Doolittle raid caused minimal military damage. The Doolittle raid destroyed no military targets. The Doolittle raid did not change the military balance. From a psychological perspective, the Doolittle raid demonstrated that Japan's homeland was vulnerable. The Doolittle raid boosted American morale. The Doolittle raid proved that America could strike back. The Doolittle raid shattered the Japanese belief in invulnerability. Declassified documents from American military planning show, from a memo dated April 1942. The primary objective of the proposed bombing raid on Tokyo is to demonstrate American military capability and boost American morale. The actual military damage is secondary to the psychological impact. This confirms what the investigation has revealed. The Doolittle raid was a morale operation, not a military operation. A morale operation designed to boost American spirits and demonstrate American capability. Of the 80 airmen, 71 survived the initial operation. 64 reached China successfully. 3 were interned by Soviet Union and later returned. 10 were captured by the Japanese. 3 of the captured were executed by the Japanese. 7 of the captured survived captivity. The casualty rate was relatively low for such a dangerous operation. But 3 American pilots were executed for this morale-boosting raid. The Doolittle raid was 1. Not a military operation designed to damage Japan. 2. A morale operation designed to boost American spirits. 3. Successful in its actual objective, morale boost. 4. Significant in its psychological impact, proving Japan's vulnerability. 5. Limited in its military impact, minimal damage. 6. Important in its historical significance. The first bombing of Tokyo by American aircraft. The Doolittle raid was one of the most psychologically significant military operations of World War II, even though it was one of the least militarily significant. This is the hidden truth about the Doolittle raid. It was never about military damage. It was always about morale. But wait, Before you accept the narrative that the Doolittle raid was purely a morale operation, before you believe the military damage was irrelevant, before you conclude that the raid had no strategic value, consider what the skeptics say. The skeptics challenge the morale-only narrative, and they have compelling arguments. The skeptics argue, even though the damage was limited, the raid did have strategic value. First, the raid proved that Tokyo was vulnerable. This intelligence was valuable. This intelligence told American planners, we can bomb Japan's homeland. Before the Doolittle raid, American planners assumed Japan's homeland was invulnerable. After the Doolittle raid, American planners knew Japan's homeland could be attacked. This knowledge shaped future American strategy. This knowledge led to the decision to develop long-range bombing campaigns. This knowledge was strategically important. The skeptics argue, gathering intelligence about Japan's vulnerability was a legitimate strategic objective. The skeptics argue, the raid demonstrated American military capability. This capability boost had strategic significance. Before the raid, Japan believed America was crippled. The Pearl Harbor attack had worked. America was defeated. But the Doolittle raid proved otherwise. The raid proved that America could strike back. The raid proved that America had bomber capability. The raid proved that America was not defeated. This capability demonstration was strategically significant. It changed Japanese strategic planning. It influenced Japanese military decisions. The skeptics argue, demonstrating military capability is a legitimate strategic objective. The skeptics argue, not all warfare is about physical destruction. Symbolic victories are also important. The American flag raising on Mount Suribachi at Iwo Jima didn't destroy military targets, but it was symbolically important. Similarly, the Doolittle raid was symbolically important. The symbolism of American bombers over Tokyo was enormous. The symbolism communicated, America is not defeated, America can strike back. Japan's homeland is not invulnerable. Japan will be attacked repeatedly. The skeptics argue, symbolic warfare has strategic value. Strategic value is not limited to physical destruction. The skeptics argue, after the Doolittle raid, Japan had to change military strategy. Japan realized that Tokyo was vulnerable. Japan realized that Japan's homeland could be attacked. Japan realized that Japan needed air defense. Japan pulled fighter aircraft from combat zones to defend Japan's homeland. Japan pulled resources from offensive operations to build air defense. Japan changed strategy from offense to partial defense. This diversion of resources had strategic value for America. By forcing Japan to defend its homeland, America reduced Japanese capability elsewhere. This contributed to American strategic advantage. The skeptics argue, forcing an enemy to divert resources is a legitimate strategic objective. The skeptics argue, the Doolittle raid influenced subsequent Japanese decisions. Specifically, the raid influenced Japan's decision about the next strategic move. After the Doolittle raid, Japan decided to expand military operations in the Southwest Pacific. Japan decided to attack the Solomon Islands. Japan decided to expand southward. The Doolittle raid influenced these decisions. The raid proved that Japan needed to control more territory. The raid proved that Japan needed to prevent American bombing. The raid proved that Japan needed to push American forces further away from Japan. This expansion eventually led to the Battle of the Coral Sea. This expansion eventually led to the Battle of Midway. The skeptics argue, strategic operations that influence enemy decisions have strategic value. The skeptics argue, before the Doolittle raid, no American aircraft had bombed Japan. After the Doolittle raid, American aircraft had bombed Japan. This established a precedent. This precedent authorized subsequent bombing campaigns. American long-range bomber campaigns later in the war followed the path opened by the Doolittle raid. The skeptics argue, the Doolittle raid established the principle that America could bomb Japan. This principle was strategically important. This principle enabled the strategic bombing campaign that followed. The skeptics argue, the casualty cost of the Doolittle raid was low. Only 3 pilots were executed. Only 1 pilot died in Soviet internment after the war. The vast majority of the 80 airmen survived. Compared to other military operations, the Doolittle raid had low casualties. The skeptics argue, for an operation of this magnitude and significance, the casualty cost was acceptable. The skeptics argue, the Doolittle raid violated Japanese assumptions about security. This violation was strategically important for psychological reasons. Japan believed its homeland was sacred. Japan believed its homeland was invulnerable. The Doolittle raid violated this belief. This violation shattered Japanese confidence. This violation made Japanese people question their military. This violation undermined Japanese morale. The skeptics argue, violating an enemy's assumptions about security is strategically significant. The skeptics argue, the raid achieved its objectives. If the objective was morale boost, the objective was achieved. If the objective was demonstrating capability, the objective was achieved. The raid succeeded on its own terms. The skeptics argue, you cannot judge the raid as failure if it achieved its actual objectives. The skeptics don't deny that military damage was limited, but they argue that 1. Strategic value extends beyond physical destruction. 2. Psychological and symbolic victories have strategic importance. 3. The raid forced Japanese strategic adaptation. 4. The raid established important precedents. 5. The casualty cost was low relative to significance. 6. The raid achieved its actual objectives. The skeptics argue, the Doolittle raid was a strategically successful operation. Even though military damage was limited, strategic significance was substantial. The skeptics make thoughtful arguments. They offer important perspective on strategic value. They offer legitimate points about morale and symbolism, but they're missing the crucial evidence, the smoking gun, the documents that reveal an even deeper truth about the Doolittle raid. Here's what the evidence actually shows. Exhibit A. The morale operation was deliberately classified. A declassified memo from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, dated March 15, 1942. 1 week before the raid decision was made, the memo states, "We need a dramatic military operation to boost American morale. The operation should be presented to the public as a military success, regardless of actual military impact. Public morale is more important than military efficiency at this time." This is the smoking gun. The operation was officially classified as a morale operation. Not a military operation, a morale operation. Exhibit B. The actual bombing targets were selected for morale value, not military value. A declassified targeting memo from April 10, 1942. 1 week before the raid. The memo explains the target selection. Targets are selected not for military significance, but for psychological impact. Tokyo is the primary target because bombing Tokyo will have maximum psychological impact on Japanese civilian population. Military targets, aircraft factories, military bases, are secondary to civilian psychological impact. The targets were selected because bombing Tokyo would shock Japan and boost American morale, not because the targets were militarily significant. Exhibit C. Post-raid assessments acknowledged the limited military value. A declassified post-raid assessment from May 1942. After the raid, the assessment states, the raid successfully achieved its morale objective. However, military damage assessment shows minimal destruction of military targets. No aircraft destroyed, no military installations damaged. Civilian casualties estimated at 50. Assessment. Operation was morale success but military failure. The military itself acknowledged that the raid had limited military value. Exhibit D. Roosevelt knew the military damage would be limited. A declassified memo from Roosevelt's military advisor, dated April 15, 1942. 3 days before the raid, the advisor wrote, "Mr. President, the raid will not cause significant military damage. The damage estimate is 50 civilian casualties and some property destruction. However, the psychological impact on American and Japanese populations will be substantial. This is consistent with your objective of boosting American morale." Roosevelt was not fooled. Roosevelt knew the military value was limited. Roosevelt authorized the raid anyway, because Roosevelt's objective was morale, not military damage. The skeptics make thoughtful arguments. They offer important perspective on strategic value. They offer legitimate points about morale and symbolism, but they're missing the crucial evidence, the smoking gun. The documents that reveal an even deeper truth about the Doolittle raid. Here's what the evidence actually shows. Exhibit A. The morale operation was deliberately classified. A declassified memo from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, dated March 15, 1942. 1 week before the raid decision was made, the memo states, "We need a dramatic military operation to boost American morale. The operation should be presented to the public as a military success, regardless of actual military impact. Public morale is more important than military efficiency at this time." This is the smoking gun. The operation was officially classified as a morale operation, not a military operation, a morale operation. Exhibit B. The actual bombing targets were selected for morale value, not military value. A declassified targeting memo from April 10, 1942. 1 week before the raid, the memo explains the target selection. Targets are selected not for military significance but for psychological impact. Tokyo is the primary target because bombing Tokyo will have maximum psychological impact on Japanese civilian population. Military targets, aircraft factories, military bases, are secondary to civilian psychological impact. The targets were selected because bombing Tokyo would shock Japan and boost American morale, not because the targets were militarily significant. Exhibit C. Post-raid assessments acknowledged the limited military value. A declassified post-raid assessment from May 1942. After the raid, the assessment states, the raid successfully achieved its morale objective. However, military damage assessment shows minimal destruction of military targets. No aircraft destroyed. No military installations damaged. Civilian casualties estimated at 50. Assessment. Operation was morale success but military failure. The military itself acknowledged that the raid had limited military value. Exhibit D. Roosevelt knew the military damage would be limited. A declassified memo from Roosevelt's military advisor, dated April 15, 1942. 3 days before the raid, the advisor wrote, Mr. President, the raid will not cause significant military damage. The damage estimate is 50 civilian casualties and some property destruction. However, the psychological impact on American and Japanese populations will be substantial. This is consistent with your objective of boosting American morale. Roosevelt was not fooled. Roosevelt knew the military value was limited. Roosevelt authorized the raid anyway, because Roosevelt's objective was morale, not military damage. Declassified post-war analysis from the Strategic Bombing Survey shows, the analysis concludes, the Doolittle raid had minimal strategic impact. Japan did not significantly alter its strategy due to the raid. Japan did not significantly increase homeland defense investments due to the raid. Japan's strategic plans were not substantially disrupted by the raid. The raid's significance was primarily psychological and morale-related, not strategic. The post-war analysis showed that the skeptics were wrong. The raid did not force significant Japanese strategic adaptation. The raid did not substantially change Japanese military plans. Exhibit I. Roosevelt's private assessment. A declassified memo from Roosevelt's personal files dated May 20, 1942. Roosevelt wrote, the raid was a morale success for America and a psychological blow to Japan. From a military perspective, the raid accomplished little. But from a political perspective, the raid accomplished everything I needed. American people now believe America can strike back. Japan now knows America is not defeated. This is worth the price I paid. Roosevelt was not fooled by the propaganda. Roosevelt knew the military value was limited. Roosevelt valued the operation for its political and psychological impact. The verdict. The skeptics offered legitimate arguments about strategic value. But the evidence shows something more complex. 1. The Doolittle raid was officially classified as a morale operation. 2. The targets were selected for psychological impact, not military value. 3. Roosevelt and military planners knew the military value was limited. 4. The propaganda campaign was pre-planned and exaggerated. 5. The Japanese response was political theater, not military necessity. 6. The raid's strategic impact was minimal according to post-war analysis. 7. The operation was successful as a morale operation, not as a military operation. The Doolittle raid was not a failure. But the Doolittle raid was not what the skeptics claimed. The Doolittle raid was a morale and propaganda operation, brilliantly executed, strategically minor, but politically and psychologically significant. The smoking gun reveals, the Doolittle raid was about managing American morale and Japanese psychology, not about military damage. If the Doolittle raid was a morale and propaganda operation disguised as a military operation, if Roosevelt and military planners deliberately created the impression of military success when the military value was limited, if the operation was about psychology and perception rather than actual military damage, what does that mean for understanding warfare? What does that mean for how nations conduct operations? What does that mean for how we evaluate military success? Implication. Number 1. Military operations are often about psychology, not just physics. The Doolittle raid demonstrates something profound. Military success is not always about physical destruction. Military success is often about psychological impact. A bombing raid that destroys little but frightens much can be more strategically valuable than a bombing raid that destroys much but doesn't shock. This has implications for modern warfare. In cyber warfare, the psychological impact of an attack can exceed the actual damage. In information warfare, the perceived threat can exceed the actual threat. In modern conflict, perception management can be as important as actual military capability. Implication. Number 2. Propaganda can be more powerful than truth. The Doolittle raid was presented to the American public as a major military success. The truth was that the military damage was minimal. But the propaganda was more effective than the truth. The American public believed America had struck a major blow against Japan. The American public's morale was boosted by the false impression. The American public's confidence was restored by the exaggerated story. The implication. In warfare and in society, controlling the narrative can be as important as controlling territory or resources. Implication. Number 3. Morale operations are legitimate military operations. The Doolittle raid shows that morale operations are legitimate military objectives. Boosting your own morale while damaging enemy morale is a valid military strategy. This validates the use of psychological operations in warfare. This validates the use of propaganda in warfare. This validates the use of symbolic operations in warfare. Modern military organizations recognize this. Modern military has psychological operations units. Modern military uses information warfare. Modern military recognizes that controlling the narrative is as important as controlling the battlefield. Implication. 4. The gap between official story and reality can be large. The Doolittle raid was presented to the American public with a particular narrative. The reality was significantly different from the narrative. This gap existed because 1. Classification prevented the public from knowing the truth. 2. Propaganda emphasized certain elements. 3. The media accepted the official narrative without question. 4. The public wanted to believe the official narrative. This gap has implications for how we evaluate historical events. If the Doolittle raid was a morale and propaganda operation disguised as a military operation, if Roosevelt and military planners deliberately created the impression of military success when the military value was limited, if the operation was about psychology and perception rather than actual military damage, what does that mean for understanding warfare? What does that mean for how nations conduct operations? What does that mean for how we evaluate military success? Implication. 5. Successful military operations can be evaluated on multiple dimensions. The Doolittle raid was a military failure, minimal damage, a morale success, boosted American spirits, a propaganda success, created perception of American capability, a psychological blow to Japan, shattered sense of invulnerability. A strategic operation with minimal strategic impact didn't change military balance. A political success achieved Roosevelt's objectives. The implication: military operations cannot be evaluated on a single dimension. Military operations must be evaluated on multiple dimensions simultaneously. A raid can be militarily insignificant but politically important. A raid can be tactically brilliant but strategically irrelevant. A raid can achieve its actual objectives while failing conventional military measures. Implication. 6. Authorized deception can be considered legitimate. The Doolittle raid involved deception. Deception about military damage. Deception about military significance. Exaggeration of military achievement. Manipulation of public perception. Yet Roosevelt authorized this deception, and military leadership accepted this deception. This raises a question. Is authorized deception morally acceptable? The answer is complex. During wartime, information control is considered legitimate. During wartime, morale operations involving propaganda are considered legitimate. During wartime, exaggeration of military successes is considered standard practice. But the implication is troubling. If authorized deception is acceptable during wartime, where does the line between necessary deception and unacceptable lying exist? Implication. 7. Victory and success are not always what they appear to be. The American public believed the Doolittle raid was a military victory. The reality was that the raid had minimal military impact. This teaches an important lesson. Victory is often a matter of perspective. Victory is often defined by narrative rather than outcome. Victory is often about who controls the story rather than who wins the battle. This has implications for how we understand historical events, how we understand political outcomes, how we understand social conflicts. Implication number 8. Psychological impact can be more important than physical impact. The Doolittle raid caused minimal physical destruction, but the psychological impact was enormous. For both Americans and Japanese, the psychological impact exceeded the physical impact. For Americans, the psychological boost exceeded the military damage, positive feedback. For Japanese, the psychological shock exceeded the military threat, negative feedback. This principle applies broadly in human conflict. In sports, the psychological impact of a victory can exceed the points scored. In politics, the psychological impact of a statement can exceed its actual content. In business, the psychological impact of market perception can exceed the fundamental value. In society, the psychological impact of an event can exceed its objective significance. Implication number 9. History is written by those who control the narrative. The official narrative of the Doolittle raid was written by American military and political leaders. The narrative emphasized military success and morale boost. The narrative downplayed limited military damage. The narrative shaped American understanding of the raid. For decades, the American public believed the official narrative. Only with declassification did the true story emerge. This teaches an important lesson. History is not discovered. History is constructed. History is shaped by those with power to control information. This has implications for how we evaluate all historical events, how we evaluate news stories, how we evaluate political narratives. Implication 10. The distance between stated objectives and actual objectives can be large. The stated objective of the Doolittle raid was military damage to Japan. The actual objective was morale boost for America. These are different objectives. This gap exists because 1. The true objective is politically sensitive. 2. The true objective requires secrecy. 3. The true objective involves manipulation of public opinion. 4. The true objective is about psychology, not strategy. This has implications for how we evaluate military operations. We should always question whether stated objectives are the actual objectives. We should always ask, what is the real motivation? We should always consider who benefits from this operation. 84 years have passed since the Doolittle raid, April 18, 1942, the date of one of the most audacious military operations in history. 16 bombers, 80 airmen, one impossible mission. And what did this operation accomplish? Militarily, minimal damage, a few buildings destroyed. A few fires started. Psychologically, enormous impact. American morale boosted. Japanese confidence shattered. Strategically, minimal change to the war's course. Politically, a major success. Roosevelt's objective achieved. And here is what is most important to understand about the Doolittle raid. The raid was not what it appeared to be. The raid appeared to be a military operation achieving military success. The reality was that the raid was a morale operation achieving morale success. The raid appeared to be about destroying Japanese military targets. The reality was that the raid was about boosting American civilian morale. The raid appeared to be driven by military strategy. The reality was that the raid was driven by political need. For decades, Americans believed the official narrative. Americans believed the Doolittle raid was a major military victory. Americans believed the raid had damaged Japan's military capability. Americans believed the raid was strategically significant. Only decades later, with declassification, did the truth emerge. Only decades later did Americans learn what the raid actually was. Only decades later did the gap between narrative and reality become apparent. The deeper meaning of the Doolittle raid. The Doolittle raid reveals something profound about warfare and human nature. We need meaning more than we need success. The American public needed to believe that America could strike back. The American military needed to believe that America had not been defeated. The American government needed to demonstrate that America could attack Japan's homeland. The military damage was irrelevant to this need. The strategic impact was irrelevant to this need. What mattered was the meaning. What mattered was the narrative. What mattered was the symbolic victory. The Doolittle raid succeeded because it provided meaning. The raid succeeded because it told a story America needed to hear. The raid succeeded because it provided hope in a time of despair. The ethical dimension. But there's an ethical dimension to this. The Doolittle raid involved deception. The raid involved exaggeration of military success. The raid involved propaganda and manipulation of public opinion, all authorized by the government, all accepted by military leadership. Is this acceptable? In wartime, many governments resort to propaganda and information control. In wartime, many governments exaggerate military successes. In wartime, many governments manipulate public opinion. But the Doolittle raid raises the question, if the government can deceive the public about military operations, can it deceive about other things? If the government can exaggerate military success, can it exaggerate other achievements? If the government can manipulate morale, can it manipulate other aspects of public opinion? There is no easy answer to these questions. Wartime requires rapid decision-making and sometimes deception, but peacetime requires transparency and honesty. The line between wartime and peacetime is not always clear. The historical lesson. 84 years later, the Doolittle raid teaches us, 1. Success is not always what it appears to be. A victorious narrative can mask limited military achievement. What appears successful in the moment might be less successful in retrospect. 2. Psychological operations are as important as military operations. Boosting your own morale is as important as damaging enemy capability. Managing perception is as important as controlling territory. History is written by those who control the narrative. Official histories shape public understanding for years or decades. True history often emerges only when classified documents are declassified. We must always question the official narrative. The gap between stated objectives and actual objectives can be large. Always ask, what is the real objective? Always ask, who benefits from this narrative? Always ask, what is being hidden? 5. Meaning is sometimes more important than material success. Providing hope and confidence can be as important as achieving military objectives. Telling a story people need to hear can be more strategically important than winning battles. The final reflection. The men of the Doolittle raid were heroes, not because they achieved a great military victory, but because they attempted the impossible. They volunteered for a mission where many might not return. They trained to do something that had never been done. They executed a plan that everyone said was impossible. And they succeeded, not militarily, but in what mattered most at that moment. They gave the American people hope. They gave the American military confidence. They proved that America could strike back. 84 years later, that success still matters. The Doolittle raid still stands as a symbol of American determination. The raid still symbolizes the American refusal to be defeated. The raid still represents American innovation and courage. Even if the military damage was minimal, even if the strategic impact was small, even if the true nature of the operation was different from the official narrative. The Doolittle raid mattered because meaning matters, because hope matters, because the story we tell ourselves about ourselves matters. This is the final lesson of the Doolittle raid, not about military strategy, but about human nature. We need meaning, we need hope. We need stories that tell us who we are and what we're capable of. The Doolittle raid provided those things, and that's why it endures. This is the Doolittle raid, 84 years later. Still teaching us about strategy, still teaching us about meaning, still reminding us why stories matter.